Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Curiosity channel. As you find a comfortable position, let your body begin to release the weight of the day. If this gentle journey is already starting to slow your thoughts, consider subscribing now, so these stories can keep finding you, night after night. Now, let the relaxation settle into your breathing. Every night, you disappear. Not metaphorically, not poetically or figuratively. Literally, consciousness fades, the body surrenders control, and for hours you exist in a state that science still can't fully explain. A state that deliberately paralyzes your muscles so you won't hurt yourself with your own dreams. A state that clears the brain of waste that, if allowed to build up over years, may contribute to mental decline decades later. A state that quietly decides which memories from your day deserve to be kept forever and which ones can be gently let go. And the strangest part of all is that you do this without question. Every night, you hand over complete control of your existence to a process your conscious mind doesn't govern, doesn't direct, doesn't even follow along with. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. And in a way, it is. And the more closely we look, the more remarkable it becomes. There's a question science still hasn't been able to answer with precision, and the more you think about it, the stranger it gets. The question is simple in form, but deep in what it carries. Why do we sleep? It seems like the answer should be obvious. We get tired. The body needs a break. But when you examine that answer carefully, it starts to fall apart. Tiredness explains the need for rest, for stopping, for not moving, for reducing effort. But it doesn't explain the need for a state as specific, as vulnerable, and as biologically complex as sleep. You could rest without sleeping. You could lie down, close your eyes, stay still for hours. And still, the body wouldn't be doing what it does during sleep. Because sleep isn't rest. It's something else entirely, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. During sleep, the brain remains extremely active. In some phases, almost as active as when you're fully awake and completely present in the world. The heart keeps beating in rhythms that shift with each stage of sleep. The lungs keep breathing, more slowly, more steadily. And entire systems of the body enter modes of operation that simply don't exist during wakefulness, modes the body waits for, modes the body needs, modes the body will seek out even when a person tries to hold off sleep for a few more hours. The glymphatic system, which clears metabolic waste from brain tissue, operates primarily during deep sleep. Growth hormone, responsible for tissue repair in adults, is released predominantly during that same phase, in a window that doesn't repeat during the day. Memory consolidation, the process by which what you learn today becomes a permanent part of who you are tomorrow, happens during specific cycles that repeat throughout the night with a surprising regularity. All of this at the same time. All of this without you having to do anything more than close your eyes and let it happen. And there's a detail that changes everything when you look at it closely: the fact that every animal with a known nervous system sleeps, or has something functionally equivalent to sleep, suggests that depriving an organism of that state is, at some deep level, incompatible with life. Flies sleep. Octopuses sleep. Zebrafish sleep. Even organisms as simple as Hydra, a tiny aquatic animal with no brain, just a few types of neurons, living in lakes and rivers for hundreds of millions of years, shows patterns of activity and rest that respond to deprivation and carry the functional characteristics of sleep. If even the Hydra sleeps, the question stops being which animals need sleep and becomes something far more fundamental: what is it about a nervous system, however simple, that makes sleep necessary? What does sleep do that no other state can do? Why has evolution, brutally efficient, quick to eliminate any trait that doesn't pay its cost, preserved sleep so carefully, across so many species, for so long? Science spent decades trying to answer that question. And the answer that emerged is, at the same time, satisfying and unsettling. Sleep likely serves multiple simultaneous functions. There isn't one single reason, one central purpose, one main function that justifies everything else. There's a set of overlapping, complementary reasons, and each one of them, on its own, would already be enough for evolution to have preserved sleep so carefully across hundreds of millions of years. Cellular restoration. Memory consolidation. Emotional regulation. Metabolic cleaning of the brain. Immune system calibration. Hormonal regulation. Maintenance of neural connectivity. And possibly other functions that haven't been fully identified yet, that science is still learning to recognize and name. Sleep does so many things at once that isolating its primary function is, in fact, a poorly formed question, like asking what the primary function of eating is, when eating nourishes, hydrates, provides energy, supports the immune system, and satisfies social and emotional needs all at the same time. For thousands of years, sleep was treated as a passive state. A biological pause. The body simply waiting for dawn while the mind went blank, while the world kept going without it. This idea was so natural, so intuitive, that no one seriously questioned it for a long time. After all, what could possibly be happening in a motionless body, with eyes closed and consciousness apparently absent? The answer, when it finally arrived, was completely unexpected. In 1929, German neurologist Hans Berger developed the electroencephalogram, the EEG, and showed for the first time that the brain generates distinct electrical patterns during sleep. That alone was significant. But it was in 1953 that the most impactful discovery happened, in a laboratory at the University of Chicago, on a night that permanently changed how science understands what occurs when we close our eyes. Nathaniel Kleitman, considered the father of modern sleep research, and his student Eugene Aserinsky were monitoring sleeping infants when they noticed something they shouldn't have been seeing. The baby's eyes were moving rapidly beneath their closed eyelids. And the brain, in that moment, was showing electrical activity nearly identical to the fully awake state. They tested adults next and found the same pattern. The brain, during certain phases of sleep, was almost as active as in a state of full wakefulness. The idea that sleep was passive became obsolete in that instant. And modern sleep research, with all the extraordinary discoveries that followed, essentially begins from that moment of surprise on a night in 1953. The stage that Kleitman and Aserinsky discovered became known as REM sleep, short for rapid eye movement. And the name captures only one of its characteristics. During REM, the eyes move. The brain is active. Emotions intensify. And the body, paradoxically, is completely paralyzed. It's within REM sleep that most vivid dreams occur. It's here that the brain processes emotional memories with a delicacy that the waking state can't replicate. It's here that connections between distant ideas are formed, that insights emerge, that the emotional processing of the day happens in a way that wakefulness simply doesn't allow. But before reaching REM, which occurs at the end of each sleep cycle, the brain moves through other stages, each with its own characteristics, its own functions, its own rhythm. A night of sleep isn't a uniform block of unconsciousness. It has an internal structure that repeats in cycles with a regularity that surprises anyone who sees it described for the first time. Each cycle lasts an average of 90 minutes. And within each cycle, the brain passes through phases that are radically different from one another, with distinct functions, distinct electrical characteristics, and physiological effects that couldn't be more different from each other. Think about that for a moment. While you sleep, and appear to be simply lying still in a uniform state of unconsciousness, the brain is running a complex program, with sequential phases, precise transitions, and specific functions at each stage. It's as if, beneath the apparently quiet surface of sleep, there exists a process of biological engineering with a sophistication that wakefulness rarely demands. The cycles divide into two broad groups: REM sleep, which includes the stages from lighter sleep all the way to the deepest, and REM sleep, which occurs at the end of each cycle. But the distribution of these stages throughout the night isn't uniform, and that asymmetry has very concrete practical consequences. In the early hours of the night, the cycles are dominated by deep sleep, the most physically restorative. In the later hours, REM begins to take up a larger and larger portion of each cycle. This means that a 5-hour night and an 8-hour night don't just differ in quantity. They differ in composition. The person who sleeps 5 hours loses disproportionately the REM sleep concentrated in the second half of the night, and ends up with a relative surplus of the deep sleep from the first hours. The person who sleeps 8 hours accumulates far more REM than would seem proportional. And since each phase does something different, something the other can't replace, that difference in composition matters just as much as the difference in duration. What almost no one realizes is that sleep doesn't begin when you close your eyes. Hours before falling asleep, a series of physiological changes are already underway, a quiet preparation that most people never consciously notice, and that the body carries out with a precision that deserves to be more widely known. The internal temperature of the body's core begins to drop. A substance called adenosine, which has been building up in every neuron during every hour you've been awake, is pressing on the brain with a growing insistence. The pineal gland, deep in the center of the brain, begins releasing melatonin in response to the arriving darkness. The heart rate slows slightly. Digestion shifts gears. The parasympathetic nervous system, the body's recovery and rest mode, begins taking over the control that the sympathetic system held throughout the day. It's like a shift change happening inside the body, gradual, coordinated, invisible to anyone who isn't looking for it. What you call tiredness, that familiar sensation of heaviness, of slowness, of wanting to lie down, isn't weakness. It isn't laziness. It isn't lack of motivation. It's a precise chemical signaling system, calibrated over millions of years of evolution, telling the body that it's time to do something only it knows how to do. It's the body inviting consciousness to step aside for a few hours so the real work can begin. The lightest stage of sleep, called N1, is that curious moment when you can still hear sounds around you, still vaguely sense the environment, still might respond if someone called your name, but you're already starting to lose the thread of your own thoughts. Ideas that seemed clear just seconds ago begin to dissolve. Control over the flow of thinking slips away gradually, like water running through your fingers. Your sense of time starts to blur. A sequence of fragmented images may appear, faces you don't recognize, places you've never been, scenes with no narrative. These aren't dreams yet. They're the first signs that the conscious filtering system is beginning to let go. It's in this transition that many people experience that sudden falling sensation, an involuntary muscle jerk that startles you awake, with the physical feeling of having lost the ground beneath your feet or slipped from somewhere high. This phenomenon has a name, hypnic myoclonia. And despite being very common, most people have felt it at least once. There's still no complete scientific consensus on why it happens. The most interesting hypothesis is that the brain, as it begins the process of falling asleep, interprets the progressive muscle relaxation as a loss of balance, and triggers an ancestral protective reflex. An evolutionary remnant from the time when our ancestors slept in elevated, vulnerable places, tree branches, rocky ledges, where a fall at the onset of sleep could be fatal. The vigilant system that was essential for survival for millions of years is still there, built into the nervous system, firing at a moment when it's no longer needed but doesn't know that yet. The body still carries the fears of its ancestors, even when it's completely safe. N1 is brief, it lasts just a few minutes, and serves as a transition between wakefulness and sleep proper. A person can be easily woken during this phase and will often not even believe they were sleeping. Asked if they fell asleep, they'll say no, they were just resting their eyes. But the EEG already shows brain waves distinct from the waking state. The fast, irregular beta waves of active wakefulness begin to be replaced by slower, more regular theta waves. The brain is already somewhere else, even if consciousness doesn't know it yet. It's the beginning of something that will deepen gradually, layer by layer, all the way to the most profound states the human nervous system can reach. Shortly after N1, the brain enters stage N2, and this is, surprisingly, where most people spend the majority of a full night of sleep. Not in deep sleep. Not in REM, with its vivid dreams. In N2, about 45 to 55% of an adult's total sleep time happens in this phase that few people know by name. It's like discovering that the longest part of a flight isn't the takeoff or the landing, but those middle hours that most people sleep through without realizing they're crossing something specific and important. N2 is marked by two very specific electrical phenomena that sleep researchers know well, and that each reveal, in their own way, something fundamental about what the brain is doing in that moment. The first are sleep spindles, rapid bursts of electrical activity lasting less than a second each, but occurring dozens of times per hour throughout the night, like small electrical whirlpools that appear and vanish on the EEG with an almost hypnotic regularity. The second are K-complexes, large amplitude waves that appear abruptly in the recording, like a distinct electrical signature, and then dissolve back into the background pattern. These two phenomena aren't inconsequential neurophysiological curiosities. They have measurable, documented functions that directly affect how you perform the next day. Sleep spindles are directly linked to memory consolidation. Studies have shown that the more spindles occur during a night, the better the performance on memory tasks the following day. This finding, repeated across dozens of different experiments with different populations, different types of tasks, and different methodologies, suggests that these very brief events, invisible to the sleeping person, undetectable without an EEG, are a central part of the process by which what you learn during the day gets transferred and permanently recorded. Sleep spindles are, in some sense, the mechanism by which the day becomes part of who you are. K-complexes, in turn, appear to function as a filtering mechanism, helping the brain evaluate external stimuli without needing to fully wake up. It's as if the central nervous system developed a way to say, in fractions of a second, that sound exists, but it's not a threat, keep sleeping, all without consciousness needing to be consulted, without sleep being interrupted. Deeper still, harder to reach, Harder to leave, and more precious from the standpoint of physical recovery, is deep sleep. Technically called N3, or slow wave sleep, this is the stage the body defends most vigorously when deprived of sleep over several days. If you deprive someone of sleep for one night and let them sleep the next, the body won't simply recover what it lost in a uniform way. It will prioritize deep sleep above everything else. As if there were an internal hierarchy of needs, and N3 were at the top of that hierarchy. During N3, the brain begins operating in delta waves, slow, large, deep oscillations that represent the most synchronized level of neuronal activity the brain reaches under any circumstances. Hundreds of millions of neurons firing in coordinated rhythm, like a full orchestra playing the same long, low note. During this phase, blood flow to the brain decreases, blood pressure drops to its lowest point of the day, breathing becomes slower and more regular than at any other moment, and the body releases most of the growth hormone produced in a 24-hour period, in a concentrated window that represents the greatest opportunity for repair and regeneration the body has in its entire daily cycle. Growth hormone, in this context, isn't just for children growing. In adults, it's essential for repairing muscle tissue damaged by daily use, for synthesizing structural proteins, for regulating metabolism, and for maintaining muscle mass that naturally decreases with age. The physical recovery you vaguely attribute to rest, that feeling of waking from a good night and the body being somehow renewed, happens specifically here, in this window of deep sleep. Not distributed evenly across the night. Not spread throughout wakefulness. Concentrated, intense, irreplaceable, in this specific stage that may be the greatest reason the body insists on sleeping even when the mind resists. And then, after deep sleep, something happens that is, from a neurological standpoint, one of the most fascinating and counterintuitive phenomena in human biology. The brain begins climbing back toward activity. Blood pressure rises slightly. Breathing changes rhythm. And the eyes begin moving rapidly beneath closed eyelids, movement that, if you watched someone sleeping at that moment, would be clearly visible even in the faint light of a bedroom at night. The EEG, at this point, shows patterns nearly identical to full wakefulness. Brain activity is intense. Neurons are firing in complex patterns, connecting distant regions of the brain, creating narratives, processing emotions. And yet the body is completely paralyzed. Unable to move. Unable to carry out the commands the brain is generating. This is REM sleep. And it is, in every sense, the strangest and most fascinating of the sleep stages. There's something apparently contradictory about it, the brain nearly awake, the body completely still, that, when understood, reveals one of the most elegant engineering solutions evolution has ever produced. The brainstem sends signals that actively block the motor neurons of the spinal cord during this phase, creating a state called muscle atonia that prevents the person from physically acting out the movements that occur in dreams. Without this mechanism, dreaming would be physically dangerous. Every dream of running would be a real run. Every dream of fighting would be a real fight. Every dream of falling would be a real fall. The nervous system, over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, developed a way to create intense internal experiences without letting those experiences spill out into the physical world. The paralysis isn't a flaw of sleep, it's a protection. It's what makes it possible to dream safely. There is a rare condition in which this blocking mechanism fails. REM sleep behavior disorder is a condition in which the muscle atonia of REM doesn't occur completely, and the person may get up, shout, punch, kick, and run during dreams, without waking up, without any memory of the episode, often frightening whoever is nearby. What's disturbing about this condition isn't just the immediate danger of the nighttime behaviors. It's what recent research has discovered about what it signals for the future. Long-term follow-up studies of people with this disorder showed that a significant portion of them go on to develop Parkinson's disease, Lewy body dementia, or other neurodegenerative diseases years, sometimes decades, after the diagnosis. REM sleep, it seems, reveals the state of the nervous system in a way that no examination performed while the person is awake can capture. The failure of muscle atonia during REM may be one of the earliest signs of a neurodegenerative process that won't become clinically apparent until much later. What seems simple, muscle paralysis during sleep, carries within it information about a person's neurological future that medicine is still learning to read. Throughout a night of sleep, the brain also goes through microarousals, very brief moments, lasting 3 to 15 seconds, in which brain activity rises close to the waking state before gently returning to sleep. A healthy adult can have between 10 and 30 of these events per hour without noticing and without the subjective quality of sleep being significantly affected. They seem to be part of the normal functioning of the brain's monitoring system during the night, small checks of the environment, quick safety inspections that the nervous system performs automatically without consulting consciousness. The sleeping brain never fully shuts off. Never. Even in the deepest sleep, some level of monitoring continues, evaluating sounds, temperatures, movements, potential threats. That's why you wake up to a baby's specific cry but not to the sound of a truck passing on the street. The system learns what's relevant, what needs to be checked, what can be ignored. The sleeping brain is always, on some level, on guard. Always, on some level, present. The problem occurs when these microarousals become too frequent and systematic, when some condition forces them to repeat dozens or hundreds of times per hour. In cases of sleep apnea, the repeated interruption of breathing during the night caused by partial collapse of the airways, the brain is forced to repeatedly surface to ensure that breathing resumes. The person doesn't consciously wake up during any of these episodes. They have no memory of them. They may spend 8 hours in bed and sleep through most of that time, and still wake up with the same exhaustion as someone who slept 3 hours. Because the sleep, in that case, is being fragmented in a way that consciousness doesn't detect but the body feels completely. It's estimated that about 1 billion people worldwide have some degree of obstructive sleep apnea. And most of them don't know it. They haven't been diagnosed. They're not in treatment. They're living with a chronic exhaustion they attribute to stress, to age, to the pace of life, when the cause is happening every single night, silently, while they sleep. This starts to get even more interesting when you realize there's a phenomenon even more subtle than micro-arousals, a phenomenon called local sleep, in which different parts of the brain can be sleeping while others are still awake. In rats kept awake for extended periods, groups of neurons were observed entering states similar to deep sleep while the animal was still moving and responding to its environment. In humans, something similar appears to occur in states of severe sleep deprivation, parts of the brain briefly switching off while the person is still technically awake, producing lapses in performance that seem inexplicable to anyone observing from the outside. The implication of this discovery is profound. Sleep may be less binary than it appears. There isn't simply asleep and awake as two mutually exclusive states with a clear boundary between them. There is a spectrum, with gradations, with parts of the brain in different states simultaneously, with regions that may be asleep while others are still operating. And this helps explain why severely sleep-deprived people make surprising errors even when they believe they're fully alert. The brain is trying to sleep in pieces, when it can't sleep as a whole. It's trying to recover what it needs, with the resources available, even if incompletely. In unfamiliar environments, the first night in a hotel, in a lab, in a house that isn't yours, one hemisphere of the brain tends to sleep less deeply than the other. The left hemisphere, associated with alertness and language functions, maintains partial vigilance in places that haven't yet been assessed as completely safe. On the second night, the pattern normalizes. The brain has learned that the place is safe enough to fully relax. This phenomenon, called the first night effect, is so consistent and well documented that researchers who study sleep in laboratories have to discard the data from participants' first night, because the sleep on that night doesn't represent their real pattern. The brain didn't sleep completely. It was on guard. It was evaluating. What this reveals is that sleeping well anywhere isn't just a matter of physical comfort. It's a matter of perceived safety. The nervous system needs to believe the environment is safe before allowing the deepest and most vulnerable sleep states. And that assessment isn't made by consciousness, but by much older monitoring systems that can't distinguish between a lion in the shadows and an unfamiliar hotel in another city. Dolphins and whales solved the impossible challenge of sleeping without drowning through a solution that biology rarely uses in such an extreme form. They sleep with only half their brain at a time. One hemisphere enters a slow-wave state similar to NREM sleep while the other remains active enough to control breathing, to maintain swimming, to monitor the environment. One eye stays open, corresponding to the awake hemisphere. Dolphins in captivity have been observed swimming in slow circles for hours in this state, one eye open and one eye closed, alternating hemispheres periodically as if trading shifts. In whales, the equivalent behavior is floating motionless at the surface, a behavior called logging, with half the brain resting while the other maintains basic control of vital functions. Migratory birds face an even more extreme challenge. During migrations, some fly for days without stopping, crossing oceans and continents in flights lasting more than a week continuously. And long-distance flight is, obviously, incompatible with conventional sleep, or it should be. Recent studies with magnificent frigate birds equipped with EEG sensors in full flight showed that these birds are capable of unihemispheric sleep during flight, resting half the brain while the other maintains the motor control needed to fly, and, more remarkably, of bilateral microsleeps during flight, very brief episodes of complete sleep, with both hemispheres sleeping simultaneously for fractions of a second, without losing control of the flight. The precision of this mechanism is remarkable. The nervous system can globally switch off, for instance, and resume control without the animal losing altitude or direction. These findings changed the understanding of the limits of sleep. The brain can be far more flexible in how and when it sleeps than any classical model predicted. Sleep isn't necessarily a state of total vulnerability requiring complete immobility and isolation from the environment. It's a state with gradations, with different forms of implementation, with solutions that evolution adapted to the specific needs of each organism that needed to sleep in ways the standard model couldn't accommodate. All of this system, the cycles, the phases, the micro-arousals, the nighttime vigilance, the partial sleep solutions, is coordinated by something that operates independently of will, of consciousness, and of any deliberate effort. A system that has existed for hundreds of millions of years and that evolution has protected with a care that can only be justified when what's being protected is absolutely essential. That system is the circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm is an internal clock that governs virtually every physiological process in the body over a cycle of approximately 24 hours. Not just sleep, though sleep is its most visible and most felt product. Body temperature follows a circadian rhythm, reaching its peak in the late afternoon and its lowest point in the early hours of the morning. Blood pressure follows a circadian rhythm. The production of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, peaks shortly after waking and declines throughout the day. The immune system has a circadian rhythm. Certain types of immune cells are more active at specific times of day. Drug metabolism follows circadian rhythms. the same medication can have different effects depending on what time it's taken. Cognitive capacity, motor coordination, reaction time, creativity, mood, all of these oscillate over 24 hours in ways that most people never stop to observe, but that researchers in chronobiology have documented with a richness of detail that continues to surprise. The word circadian comes from Latin circa diem, meaning around a day. And the choice of around isn't linguistic imprecision. It's the most precise description possible. The human biological clock, when completely isolated from external references, no natural light, no clock, no meal schedule, no social interaction, no cues from the outside world whatsoever, tends to run in cycles slightly longer than 24 hours. Between 24 hours and 10 minutes and 24 hours and 30 minutes in most people. This means that without external calibration, humans naturally drift their schedules later each day. Like a clock that gains a few minutes every day and, without being corrected, would progressively fall out of sync with the world around it, eventually showing night when it's morning. What keeps this clock synchronized with the real 24-hour cycle is, primarily, light, especially morning light. Specialized cells in the retina, different from the ones we use to see images, and functional even in people with complete blindness for colors or shapes, detect light and send signals directly to a tiny structure in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. A cluster of only about 20,000 neurons, remarkably small, considering the human brain has around 86 billion neurons in total, located exactly above the crossing of the optic nerves, in a position that doesn't seem accidental. The body's central clock is positioned to receive information about light directly from the eyes, before any other area of the brain processes what's being seen. This tiny cluster of neurons is the conductor of the entire body. It coordinates the rhythms of virtually every organ and tissue, not because it creates those rhythms, but because it synchronizes them. And here is the detail that changes everything. Virtually every cell in the body has its own internal molecular clock. Sets of genes that switch on and off in regular cycles of approximately 24 hours, producing proteins in precise rhythms, creating an oscillation that follows its own timing even in isolated cell cultures in a laboratory, far from any external influence. The liver has a clock. The lungs have a clock. The intestines have a clock. The heart has a clock. The muscles have clocks. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is what ensures that all these clocks are showing the same time, that the liver and the brain and the immune system are all operating on the same schedule, coordinated, synchronized, functioning as parts of one organism and not as independent units that happen to share a body. In 2017, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to 3 American scientists, Jeffrey Hall, Michael Rosbash, and Michael Young, for the discovery of the molecular mechanisms that control this clock. The award was the highest level of scientific recognition for something that molecular biology had been building toward for decades. Time is a fundamental dimension of physiology, not just of the environment. It's not only the world that has a 24-hour cycle. The living organism does too. And that cycle isn't just a response to the environment, it's an intrinsic property of every cell, preserved across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. What these researchers described was a genetic feedback loop. Certain genes produce proteins that, when they reach a certain concentration, block their own production, creating a natural oscillation of approximately 24 hours. Simple in concept, sophisticated in execution, universal in distribution. This mechanism was first discovered in fruit flies, but proved to be evolutionarily conserved in virtually every complex organism on Earth, including plants, fungi, and every animal studied so far. The same molecular principle that regulates the sleep of a fly regulates the sleep of a human being. Evolution preserved it for hundreds of millions of years, adjusting details, adapting frequencies, but keeping the central structure intact, evidence that tampering with it carries a cost that evolution rarely tolerated. Within this enormous and precise circadian system, there are two main mechanisms that regulate sleep itself, two systems that operate in parallel and that need to be aligned for sleep to be full and restorative. The first is homeostatic sleep pressure, the progressive buildup of adenosine in the brain during every hour you stay awake. The second is the circadian signal, the 24-hour rhythm that determines when the body is biologically prepared to sleep and when it's biologically prepared to be awake. Adenosine is a natural byproduct of neuronal metabolism. Every active neuron produces adenosine as a consequence of its own functioning, like the exhaust of an engine that, as it runs, inevitably produces heat. And adenosine, unlike heat, doesn't dissipate. It accumulates. It binds to specific receptors in the brain and progressively reduces alertness, increases sleepiness, and prepares the nervous system for sleep. The longer you stay awake, the more adenosine builds up, the stronger the drive to sleep becomes, until it becomes difficult to ignore, then difficult to resist, and finally irresistible. It's an elegant feedback system, almost poetic in its logic. The brain's own activity gradually generates the signal that it's time to stop. The work creates the tiredness. The tiredness creates the sleep. The sleep clears the adenosine. And the cycle begins again. What many people don't know, and what explains a lot about how caffeine works and why coffee sometimes leaves you more tired than before, is that caffeine doesn't eliminate adenosine. It doesn't break down the molecule, doesn't speed up its metabolism, doesn't remove its effects in any lasting way. What it does is temporarily block the receptors that adenosine uses to signal the brain. Adenosine keeps building up while the block is active. It simply can't deliver its message, can't be read by the system. The brain doesn't know it's tired, because the tiredness signal is blocked. When the caffeine wears off, when the caffeine molecules dissociate from the receptors and leave the system, all the adenosine that accumulated during that period binds at once, and the energy crash that follows isn't accidental. It isn't a coincidence. It's the debt being collected in full and immediately. The tiredness wasn't eliminated. It was postponed. And when the debt is collected, it's collected with the adenosine from the entire period the caffeine was active, plus the adenosine that kept building up since then. The crash can be sharper than the original tiredness would have been without the caffeine. There's another detail about caffeine that most people have never considered, and that, once understood, changes the way you think about that afternoon cup of coffee. The half-life of caffeine in the body, the time it takes for half of the consumed amount to be metabolized and eliminated, is approximately 5 to 7 hours in healthy adults. That alone is already longer than most people intuitively assume. But this value varies significantly between individuals, for genetic reasons controlled by variants of the CYP1A2 gene, which codes for the enzyme responsible for caffeine metabolism in the liver. Fast metabolizers process caffeine within a few hours and feel relatively little effect. Slow metabolizers, a considerable portion of the population, may still have half the caffeine concentration from a cup consumed at 2 in the afternoon active in their bloodstream at 9 at night. For these people, afternoon coffee doesn't produce outright insomnia, it doesn't keep them fully awake at midnight. The effect is more subtle, it reduces deep sleep, slightly fragments the cycles, diminishes the overall quality of sleep in a way that's completely invisible to anyone not measuring it with an EEG. The person wakes up and feels fine, but not as fine as they could. Not fully rested. With that residual tiredness that never quite disappears even after a good night's sleep. And they never connect it to the coffee they had at 3 in the afternoon the day before. The effect is there. It's just not perceived. Melatonin is often called the sleep hormone, and while that description captures something true, it doesn't accurately convey what melatonin actually does. Melatonin doesn't directly induce sleep the way a sedative would, it doesn't switch off the brain, doesn't deepen sleep, doesn't significantly alter the architecture of sleep cycles in supplemental doses. What it does is something more subtle and more fundamental. It signals to the body that it's dark, that night has arrived, that it's time to begin preparing for sleep. It's a timing hormone, a circadian messenger, more than a direct promoter of sleep. It's produced by the pineal gland, a small structure in the center of the brain that René Descartes, in the 17th century, called the seat of the soul, perhaps because its central and solitary position in the middle of the brain, with no bilateral counterpart, seemed too special to be just another organ. Under natural conditions, melatonin levels begin to rise 1 to 2 hours before the usual time of falling asleep, in a gradual progression, not an abrupt spike. They reach their peak in the early hours of the morning. And they begin to fall before dawn, guided by the approaching light signal, like a wave that rises with the darkness and retreats with the light. The problem is that modern life has introduced a source of light that the human circadian system had never encountered throughout its entire evolutionary history: artificial light rich in blue wavelengths, emitted by the screens of cell phones, computers, televisions, and the LED lighting that has become standard in homes, offices, streets, and commercial spaces around the world. For almost all of human history, the night was dark, with the exception of fire, which emits predominantly red and orange light, with low impact on the circadian system. White and blue electric lighting is an invention less than 150 years old. And the human circadian system, calibrated over millions of years to use blue light as a signal for daytime, has no way to distinguish the blue light of a 10 a.m. sky from the blue light of a cell phone screen at 11 p.m. Specialized cells in the retina, called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, are exquisitely sensitive to exactly that range of the spectrum. They detect blue light and send signals directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus saying, "It's still daytime." The result is the suppression of melatonin production, the nighttime signal that simply isn't released while the system is receiving information that the day is still happening. Studies show that 2 hours of screen exposure before bed can delay the release of melatonin by up to 90 minutes. This doesn't just mean falling asleep later, it means the entire circadian cycle is pushed forward, that the sleep phases that should occur at certain times become compressed or interrupted, and that the person arrives at the REM sleep of the early morning hours with less quality sleep than they would have had if they'd gone to sleep at the correct biological time. The screen doesn't just delay sleep. It alters its structure. The circadian rhythm also isn't the same for everyone, and that variation has a name, a real genetic basis, and practical implications that go far beyond what most people imagine when they think about the difference between people who like to wake up early and those who function better at night. That name is chronotype. And chronotype isn't a preference, isn't a habit, isn't a matter of discipline or willpower. It's a biological characteristic with genetic roots just as real as height or eye color. Chronotypes form a continuous spectrum that ranges from the extremely morning-oriented, who wake up naturally early, reach peak performance in the morning, and feel sleepy early in the evening, sometimes before 10 p.m., to the extremely evening-oriented, who function best in the afternoon and at night, whose body temperature is still rising at midnight, who have genuine difficulty waking up early and feel completely unfocused in the first hours of the morning regardless of how much they slept. Most people fall somewhere in between these two extremes, with leanings more toward one side or the other. And about 50% of individual variation in chronotype is heritable, a number high enough to make clear that this isn't a choice. Calling someone lazy for not being able to wake up at 6 in the morning can be biologically just as unfair as calling someone short for not reaching 6'3". Height and chronotype have equally real roots in the genome. Chronotype also changes throughout life in a way that is striking, well documented, and has implications that society is still learning to take seriously. Young children tend to be morning-oriented. They wake up early, go to sleep early, follow a rhythm their parents frequently envy. At puberty, something changes dramatically. The biological clock undergoes a real, documented, measurable phase delay, and not a cultural preference built by screen exposure or peer influence, but a genuine biological shift in the phase of the circadian system that pushes sleep timing progressively later throughout the adolescent years. Melatonin levels begin rising later at night. Body temperature reaches its lowest point later in the early morning. The morning alertness peak is pushed later in the day. All of this happens in a coordinated way, as part of a biological program of puberty that we still don't fully understand. This means that asking a teenager at the peak of this circadian delay to go to sleep at 10 p.m. and wake up at 6 a.m. is, from a biological standpoint, equivalent to asking an adult to go to sleep at 7 p.m. and wake up at 3 in the morning. The morning school schedule imposed on adolescents comes into direct and systematic conflict with the biology of that phase of life. The consequences are measurable and concerning. Chronically sleep-deprived teenagers show worse academic performance, greater impulsivity, more emotional instability, poorer mood regulation, higher risk of traffic accidents, and significantly worse mental health indicators than teenagers whose sleep schedules are respected. Countries and states that have experimented with delaying school start times have reported consistently positive results across all of these indicators. The debate about school schedules is, to a large extent, a debate about circadian biology. And the evidence points in a pretty clear direction. There's a specific window in the early afternoon, generally between 1 and 3 p.m., when sleepiness naturally increases in almost every human being, regardless of what they ate for lunch, regardless of how much they slept the night before, regardless of workload. This phenomenon, called the circadian dip, or the afternoon circadian trough, appears even in people kept in environments completely free of time cues, with no clocks, no natural light, no reference to the hour whatsoever. The sleepiness arises anyway, at the same relative moment in each person's circadian cycle. This suggests something that sleep researchers have debated for decades. The human body may have been evolutionarily programmed not for a single block of sleep per night, but for 2 sleep periods per day, 1 long period at night and 1 brief period in the early afternoon. In many Mediterranean and Latin American cultures, the siesta is a traditional practice that coincides exactly with this biological window, not by accident, but through millennia of adaptation. And modern research on napping confirms that a brief sleep of 10 to 20 minutes during this period can significantly restore alertness, creativity, decision-making capacity, and motor performance for the rest of the day. NASA studies with military pilots showed that a 26-minute nap improved performance by 34% and alertness by 100% in the hours that followed. Studies with athletes showed improvements in reaction speed, accuracy, and endurance after pre-competition naps. The problem is that naps longer than 20 to 30 minutes enter deep sleep territory and produce that familiar feeling of disorientation upon waking, sleep inertia, that state of confusion and grogginess where you're not quite sure what time it is, where you are, or what you were doing. Sleep inertia is physiologically real. It's not psychological. It's not an overreaction. It's the result of having the brain abruptly pulled from a state of deep slow waves before completing the process it had begun. The brain needs time to transition back to activity patterns compatible with full functioning, and until that time passes, performance can be surprisingly compromised, in some studies comparable to someone who hasn't slept the entire night. That's why the moment of waking matters just as much as the moment of falling asleep. Waking at the end of a sleep cycle, when the brain is in lighter sleep, naturally transitioning toward wakefulness, tends to produce a much smoother and more functional awakening than being abruptly pulled out of deep sleep. The alarm that goes off at the right time and the alarm that goes off at the wrong time can produce radically different mornings, even with the same number of hours of sleep. And now we arrive at something that science discovered in 2013, a discovery that substantially changed the way neuroscientists understand the function of sleep, and that, when you fully understand it, transforms the way you think about what's happening inside your head every night while you sleep. During deep sleep, the brain performs a cleaning operation that is literally impossible during wakefulness. In the waking state, brain cells are slightly swollen, leaving little space between them. The brain tissue is compact, dense, active, processing information continuously. During deep sleep, these cells contract to about 60% of their volume, a dramatic reduction that opens channels through the brain tissue through which cerebrospinal fluid flows actively, like a rinse, sweeping away metabolic waste that built up throughout the day of intense neuronal activity. This cleaning system has a name, the glymphatic system. And when Maiken Nedergaard and her collaborators described it for the first time in 2013, the discovery was surprising enough to be published in the journal Science and to begin a partial reorientation of how the field understood the function of sleep. Not because the idea that sleep has a restorative function was new, but because now there was a concrete, observable, measurable mechanism for one of those functions. A mechanism that explained, in a partial but significant way, why the brain specifically needs sleep, not just rest, not just stillness, but the specific neural state of deep sleep that allows cells to contract and channels to open. Among the substances cleared by this process is the protein beta-amyloid, one of the main compounds associated with the buildup of plaques in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Under normal conditions, this protein is produced as a byproduct of neuronal activity during wakefulness and is cleared during sleep. But studies in animals showed that a single night of sleep deprivation is enough to significantly increase beta-amyloid levels in the brain. Not decades of deprivation. not years. One night. The implication is still being investigated carefully, and researchers are cautious about making strong causal claims in humans. But the direction is clear, and the consistency of the findings across different animal models and the human neuroimaging studies available is enough for several research groups to consider chronic insufficient sleep as a potentially relevant risk factor for neurodegenerative diseases, not the sole cause, not the determining factor, but a contributor that, unlike many risk factors, is partly within each person's behavioral control. What seems simple, sleeping well, may carry within it, potentially, decades of silent consequences that accumulate long before any symptoms appear. Memory isn't a continuous recording that simply receives data and stores it. It doesn't work like a file being passively filled throughout the day. It's an active process of selection, consolidation, and reorganization, and much of that process happens during sleep, without the person having any awareness of it, without needing to do anything beyond being asleep and letting the brain do what it learned to do over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. During wakefulness, the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped brain structure located deep in the temporal lobe, fundamental for the formation of new memories, records experiences temporarily, like a scratch pad that can be overwritten, that has limited capacity, that wasn't designed for permanent storage but for rapid capture of information as it's happening. Information arrives, gets tagged with some indication of relevance or emotional urgency, and is held provisionally in this temporary workspace. During sleep, especially during deep sleep and REM, this information is transferred and integrated into the cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, where long-term memory traces are maintained in a distributed way across vast stretches of cortical tissue. This process is called memory consolidation, and it isn't simply a copy of what was experienced. The brain doesn't transfer everything equally, doesn't give the same weight to each experience of the day. It prioritizes. Memories with intense emotional content receive preferential treatment. The nervous system learned that events that generate strong emotion tend to be relevant to survival or well-being. Memories relevant to prior experiences and knowledge are more easily integrated. What connects to something already existing is easier to anchor and to use in the future. Details considered peripheral, contextual, or redundant are actively discarded, not through failure, but by design, so that storage doesn't get overloaded with information that will never be useful. Sleeping isn't just storing. It's editing. And that nightly editing is part of why studying and then sleeping produces superior learning outcomes compared to studying for more hours without sleeping adequately. Not just because a rested brain is more efficient, but because sleep literally finishes the work that studying began. There's a classic experiment in sleep research that demonstrates this in an almost unsettling clarity. Participants were trained on a finger movement sequence, similar to playing a scale on the piano, a series of keys to be pressed in a specific order as quickly and precisely as possible. After a practice period, they were tested a few hours later. The group that slept between training and testing improved significantly in both speed and accuracy. The group that stayed awake for the same interval showed no equivalent improvement. What sleep did in that case wasn't just preserve what was learned, it continued the learning autonomously, without the body moving, without the person knowing. The brain kept practicing and refining the motor sequence during sleep, reactivating the circuits used in training, consolidating the patterns, optimizing the timing. This process was confirmed by EEG recordings that showed activation of the same brain regions used during training occurring spontaneously during subsequent sleep, as if the brain were, in silence, repeating the exercise on its own. The body practices while it sleeps. And sleep spindles, those very brief electrical events of stage N2 that we mentioned earlier, appear to play a central role in this process. The more spindles during sleep following a motor learning session, the greater the performance improvement the next day. Sleep doesn't just preserve what was learned. It optimizes what was learned. REM sleep appears to have an especially important function for a specific type of memory that goes beyond remembering facts and procedures, emotional memory. Not just in the sense of remembering events that carried emotional weight, but in the deeper sense of processing and regulating the emotional intensity associated with those events, of separating the informational content of an experience from the emotional charge that accompanied it, so that the memory can be accessed and used without the original emotion being relived with the same intensity. An influential hypothesis, developed and clearly articulated by neuroscientist Matthew Walker in his work, proposes that during REM the brain reprocesses emotionally intense memories in a very particular neurochemical environment, with significantly reduced levels of noradrenaline, the substance associated with alertness, stress, and the fight-or-flight response. This peculiar neurochemical environment of REM would allow the emotional content of the experience to be accessed, re-experienced at some level, and integrated into the person's memory without the original intensity of the stress being fully reinstated. It's like processing the content of a difficult experience within a kind of protection, within a state where the molecules of stress have gone quiet. In practical terms, this means that sleeping after a difficult experience can literally reduce the emotional weight associated with it by the next morning. The memory remains, the event is still remembered, the details are still accessible, but the sharp pain associated with it may be smaller. Studies have shown that people deprived of REM sleep after negative experiences tend to react with greater emotional intensity to disturbing images and situations the next day, as if the nightly processing that normally softens the charge hadn't occurred. In people with post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition in which REM sleep is frequently fragmented, interrupted, or qualitatively altered, traumatic memories appear not to go through the same nightly softening process. They remain with the original emotional charge intact, or nearly intact, being reactivated with the same intensity repeatedly. The persistence of symptoms may be partly tied to a sleep that can't complete the work it needed to do, that can't process what was experienced in a way that makes it bearable to carry. Sleep doesn't just consolidate what happened. It changes how you feel about what happened. The dreams of REM sleep are typically vivid, emotionally intense, narratively elaborate, and frequently bizarre in a way that doesn't follow the rules of waking logic. People fly. Dead acquaintances appear and speak. Impossible places exist with perfect internal coherence. Situations that would be obviously absurd while awake seem completely normal inside the dream, without the dreamer questioning anything. And the bizarreness isn't random, it reflects with precision a specific characteristic of how the brain functions during this phase. The prefrontal cortex, the frontmost region of the brain, associated with logical reasoning, planning, evaluation of plausibility, and critical thinking, has its activity significantly reduced during REM sleep. At the same time, limbic regions tied to emotion and hippocampal regions tied to memory are highly active. The result is an experience with strong emotional storylines, with memories and associations flowing freely, but without the critical filter that, when awake, would tell us something doesn't make sense. That's why completely unlikely situations seem perfectly normal inside a dream. The brain simply doesn't have, in that moment, the active mechanism to question the coherence of what it's experiencing. The questioning has been temporarily switched off, and without it, anything seems possible. Why do we dream? This is one of humanity's oldest questions and one of neuroscience's most resistant ones. There are several well-supported hypotheses. None has been conclusively proven. And the fact that the question is still open after decades of intensive research is, in itself, revealing of how much dreaming still holds that is mysterious. One of the most discussed theories proposes that dreams function as a simulation environment where the brain practices responses to dangerous situations, a kind of evolutionary training for real threats. The fact that nightmares and dreams involving pursuit, falling, loss of control, appearing in public undressed, arriving late to something important are universally common across all human cultures, in all recorded eras, in children who haven't yet been exposed to specific cultural narratives about dreams. This suggests something that goes far beyond chance or cultural coincidence. These recurring themes appear in cultures so distinct that they can hardly be explained by shared cultural experiences alone. The hypothesis that they reflect ancestral patterns of threat, situations that were evolutionarily relevant to human survival for hundreds of thousands of years, is consistent with the distribution that's observed. Another hypothesis proposes that dreams are a byproduct of the memory consolidation process, images and narratives generated while the brain reorganizes and integrates experiences from the day, combining them with long-term memories, testing connections, building schemas. In this view, the content of the dream wouldn't have a function in itself. it would be more like the visible noise of a process that serves other purposes. The two hypotheses aren't mutually exclusive. And it's possible, perhaps even likely, that dreams serve multiple functions at the same time, just as sleep in general serves multiple functions that don't exclude each other. There's a rare and fascinating state in which a person is sleeping, dreaming, and at the same time knows they're inside a dream, maintaining enough consciousness to observe, reflect, and sometimes influence what happens. This state is called lucid dreaming, and its existence was confirmed scientifically in an ingenious way that resolves the obvious methodological problem: how do you prove that someone is conscious while asleep? The solution came from the fact that during REM, the muscles of the body are paralyzed, except the eyes, which continue moving freely and whose movements can be voluntarily controlled even within the dream. Researchers agreed with participants trained in lucid dreaming on a code of eye movements to be executed inside the dream as soon as lucidity was reached, for example, 2 horizontal movements to the left followed by 2 to the right, in a sequence that would be different from any random pattern of eye movement. The participants were able to signal with their eyes, in real time, during REM sleep, while their bodies remained paralyzed and EEGs confirmed they were asleep. They were, simultaneously, asleep and conscious. In 2 states at once. A hybrid state that doesn't fit into any conventional category. Neuroimaging of lucid dreams shows increased activation of the prefrontal cortex, exactly the region that in normal dreams is suppressed, compared to regular REM. Lucid dreaming involves, it seems, a partial reactivation of the circuits of self-awareness and critical reasoning, enough for the person to know they're dreaming, but not enough to dissolve the dream or turn it into wakefulness. It's a state that exists on a border that most people never consciously visit, but that reveals something important about what consciousness is, and about what it isn't, necessarily, all the time. Sleep deprivation produces effects that go far beyond simple tiredness and the desire to sleep. And one of the most unsettling and practically relevant aspects of all the research on sleep deprivation is this: the more sleep-deprived a person is, the less they can perceive their own degree of impairment. The deterioration of judgment affects, specifically, the capacity to evaluate one's own judgment. It's a circular trap that closes silently. Classic studies placed participants in progressive sleep deprivation, reducing sleep time per night over consecutive days, and measured both objective performance on standardized tasks and the participants' subjective assessment of how they felt and how they thought they were performing. Objective performance declined in a linear and consistent way with each hour of sleep lost, accumulating deficits that added up over the days with no evidence of adaptation. But the participants' subjective assessments of how they felt stopped declining after 1 or 2 days. The body had gotten used to the state of deprivation and began treating it as normal, began using that state as the reference point for evaluating its own functioning. A person who has been awake for 17 hours shows cognitive impairment on standardized tests comparable to someone with a blood alcohol level of 0.05%, the legal limit for driving in many countries. And they generally believe they're functioning fine. They generally believe they're just a little tired, that a coffee will fix it, that they can still make good decisions. Alcohol and sleep deprivation impair judgment in comparable ways, but while alcohol intoxication is socially visible and socially condemned, sleep deprivation is invisible and frequently celebrated. The immune system also pays a price that most people never connect to the amount of sleep they get. 1 week of less than 6 hours per night significantly reduces the activity of natural killer cells, NK cells, which are part of the body's first line of defense against viruses and cells that may become cancerous. In one particularly direct experiment, volunteers were exposed to the common cold virus, administered via nasal drops, under controlled conditions, after having their sleep rigorously monitored for 2 weeks. Those who slept less than 6 hours per night were 4 times more likely to develop a cold than those who slept 7 hours or more. The difference wasn't in exposure to the virus, everyone was exposed to the same conditions, the same virus, the same dose. The difference was in the immune system's capacity to respond to the exposure and contain it before a full infection took hold. People vaccinated after adequate nights of sleep produce significantly higher antibody levels than those vaccinated in a state of sleep deprivation. Sleep doesn't just help the body recover from the efforts of the day. It prepares it to respond to what's coming. Sleep deprivation directly alters 2 hormones fundamental to appetite regulation, and does so in a way that, once understood, explains many eating patterns that seem inexplicable in terms of conscious choice. Ghrelin, the hormone that signals hunger to the brain, that activates the desire to eat, has its levels increased by sleep deprivation. Leptin, the hormone that signals satiety, that tells the brain there's already enough energy available, that it's time to stop eating, has its levels decreased. The combined result is a person who is hungrier than they normally would be, with less of a sense of satisfaction after eating than they normally would have, and with a specific and intensified craving for foods high in carbohydrates and fats, the energy-dense foods that the ancestral body sought during times of scarcity and threat. What almost no one realizes is that this isn't lack of discipline. It isn't weakness of character. It isn't a problem of choice. It's biochemistry responding rationally, from an evolutionary standpoint, to a state that, for the body, resembles resource deprivation. If you haven't slept, the nervous system may interpret that as evidence that something is wrong, that there's a threat, that the environment is dangerous, and in moments of threat, evolutionary logic says, eat more, store more energy, prepare for the effort that may be coming. The logic that kept us alive for millions of years now, in environments of food abundance and physical safety, contributes to patterns that work against health. Alcohol has a widely held reputation for helping with sleep, and that reputation isn't entirely unfounded. But it's deeply misleading in a way that has real consequences for millions of people who use a drink at night as a sleep strategy without realizing what they're doing to the quality of the sleep that follows. Alcohol does in fact speed up the onset of sleep. It reduces the time to fall asleep in a measurable way. And it increases deep sleep in the first hours of the night. The first 2 or 3 hours after falling asleep generally show more N3 than would be expected without alcohol. Up to this point, the reputation holds. The problem is what happens afterward. As the liver metabolizes the alcohol, a process that takes several hours, generally completing itself in the second half of the night, a significant rebound effect occurs. Sleep fragments. Microarousals increase. REM sleep, suppressed by alcohol in the first hours, resurges in an intense and disrupted way in the second half of the night, in a rebound pattern that isn't equivalent to normal REM. The person may have spent 8 hours in bed and slept through most of that time, but the architecture of the sleep was compromised in a way that instruments measure clearly and that the body feels as exhaustion, even without the person being able to articulate why they feel bad after a night that seemed long. Beyond that, alcohol relaxes the muscles of the upper airways, which aggravates or triggers episodes of sleep apnea and worsens snoring in people who already have a tendency to snore. And the subjective feeling of having rested after drinking is, in large part, an illusion produced by the sedative effect of the alcohol itself, which reduces the perception of arousals and fragmentation without eliminating their effects on sleep. The brain doesn't remember the arousals, but the body felt every one of them. Sleepwalking occurs predominantly during deep sleep, not during REM sleep, as many people imagine, perhaps because we intuitively associate sleepwalking with dreams and dreams with REM. But what happens in sleepwalking isn't the acting out of dreams. It's a partial dissociation between different systems of the brain. The parts responsible for automatic movement, spatial navigation, and basic motor behavior are active, while the regions associated with consciousness, judgment, situational awareness, and memory formation remain in deep sleep. The result is a person who moves, talks, sometimes eats, sometimes leaves the house, with behaviors that appear purposeful from the outside, completely unaware of any of it and forming no memory of the episode. Waking up in the morning, they have no recollection. For them, it was a normal night of sleep. The belief that waking a sleepwalker is dangerous has no solid scientific basis. Waking them may cause temporary disorientation and confusion, because the transition from deep sleep to wakefulness is abrupt and disorienting, but it causes no documented physical or psychological harm. What is genuinely dangerous is the sleepwalking episode itself, the person carrying out risky actions with no awareness of what they're doing, with no ability to evaluate dangers, with no memory that would allow learning from mistakes. Sleepwalkers can fall down stairs, walk out into traffic, turn on stoves, overeat, drive vehicles, all of this without awareness, without memory, without control. And in rare and extreme cases, violent behaviors during sleepwalking episodes have been documented, and have led to complex legal cases about criminal responsibility in states of proven unconsciousness. Sleep has consequences that extend far beyond the individual who sleeps. Narcolepsy is frequently portrayed inaccurately in films and TV shows, as people simply blacking out without warning in any situation, in a sudden and dramatic collapse that makes for comedic scenes but doesn't reflect the clinical reality of the condition. Narcolepsy is an autoimmune disorder in which the immune system, for reasons that still aren't completely understood, possibly triggered by an infection in genetically predisposed individuals, selectively destroys the hypocretin-producing neurons in the hypothalamus. Hypocretin, also called orexin, is a neurotransmitter that functions as a stabilizer of the waking state. In people without narcolepsy, it keeps the brain locked into the awake state during the day, preventing elements of REM sleep, especially muscle atonia and dream activity, from invading wakefulness uninvited. Without hypocretin, the boundary between sleep and wakefulness becomes unstable and permeable. Sleep can invade wakefulness. The muscle atonia of REM can occur while the person is awake. This produces the most characteristic and most revealing symptom of narcolepsy, cataplexy, which is a sudden, abrupt loss of muscle tone triggered by intense emotions. Especially, and curiously, by laughter. Joy, humor, an unexpected burst of laughter, can trigger an episode in which the knees buckle, the face droops, the arms lose strength, and in more severe cases the person falls completely to the ground, conscious but unable to move for a few seconds or minutes. It's as if the body enters REM for a few moments while the mind is still awake. A direct window into the mechanism that, under normal conditions, keeps the world of sleep and the world of wakefulness completely separate, and that, when absent, reveals how much that separation depends on a specific substance, produced by a specific set of neurons, whose absence is enough for the boundaries to begin dissolving. Sleep has a relationship with mental health that goes far beyond the simple observation that depressed people sleep poorly and anxious people have difficulty sleeping. The relationship is bidirectional, deep, and complex in a way that psychiatry is still mapping. Sleep disorders can precipitate episodes of mental illness in vulnerable people, and mental disorders frequently disrupt sleep in specific and characteristic ways, creating cycles that reinforce each other, in which each side worsens the other, until separating cause from effect becomes impossible without therapeutic intervention. In depression, the sleep pattern presents very specific and consistent alterations that researchers have learned to recognize. REM sleep begins earlier in the night than normal, in an anticipation called reduced REM latency, is more intense, more dense, longer in the first hours. At the same time, deep sleep, N3, is reduced. This pattern is almost the inverse of the healthy pattern, in which REM concentrates in the second half of the night and deep sleep dominates the first hours. This specific anomaly is so characteristic of depression that it has been proposed as a biological marker of the condition, a measurable signal that something in the circadian and emotional processing is altered in a way that predicts and accompanies the depressive state. What's particularly intriguing is that selective REM sleep deprivation, waking patients every time they enter that phase, systematically, has been documented as producing temporary improvement in depressive symptoms in some cases. And part of the mechanism of action of older antidepressants, tricyclics and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, involves significant suppression of REM sleep. An effect that psychiatry initially considered a side effect and potentially problematic, but that may, paradoxically, contribute to therapeutic efficacy. The excessive and early REM of depression may not be just a passive symptom of the condition, it may be an active factor in its maintenance. Sleep isn't just a symptom of mental health. In some respects, it may be one of its mechanisms. Creativity and sleep have a connection that goes beyond sporadic insights and stories of great ideas that came from dreams. REM sleep measurably increases the capacity to make remote associations, to connect distant concepts that don't seem related at first glance, to see patterns in information that appears disconnected, to find solutions that conventional linear analysis wouldn't find. This capacity is the substrate of much of what we call creativity, intuition, and insight. In experiments, groups of participants were exposed to problems that had straightforward solutions but also hidden shortcuts, rules or patterns that dramatically simplified the process if recognized. After a night of sleep, almost triple the number of participants discovered the shortcut compared to those who stayed awake for the same period. Sleep didn't just consolidate what was learned, it allowed the brain to reorganize the information in a way that revealed a structure that wasn't visible before. Something was there the whole time. Sleep found it. The hypnagogic state, that moment between sleep and wakefulness, when consciousness starts losing its grip but hasn't fully fallen asleep yet, was deliberately explored by some thinkers and artists as a source of creative material. Thomas Edison, according to multiple contemporary accounts, had the habit of falling asleep in a chair while holding metal balls in his pockets or in his hands. When he relaxed completely and drifted off, the balls would drop to the floor with enough noise to wake him, bringing back the images and thoughts he'd experienced in the hypnagogic state just seconds before. Salvador Dali described a similar technique with a key in his hand. The idea was to capture the content of a state in which the critical filter is reduced, in which unlikely connections emerge more easily, in which thinking starts to move in ways that conventional wakefulness doesn't allow. It wasn't mysticism. It was method. It was the empirical recognition, long before any neuroscientific confirmation, that the brain transitioning into sleep does something different from what it does while awake, and that something can be valuable. The musician Paul McCartney reported hearing the complete melody of Yesterday in a dream. The chemist Auguste Kekule described visualizing the ring structure of benzene in a state of daydream or dream. The writer Robert Louis Stevenson claimed that parts of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came from dreams. Regardless of how much of these stories is literal and how much is retrospective construction, the human tendency to create coherent narratives about origins, they point to something that neuroscience is increasingly documenting: the sleeping brain, or the brain in transition to sleep, isn't less capable than the waking brain. In certain types of thinking, associative, divergent, connective, it may be more. Total sleep deprivation is one of the most disorienting and progressively incapacitating experiences a human being can go through. In 1964, an American student named Randy Gardner, then 17 years old, stayed awake for 11 days and 25 minutes, 264 consecutive hours, under the scientific supervision of William Dement, one of the most important sleep researchers of the 20th century. The goal was to break the world record for documented deprivation, and Gardner did it with a remarkable discipline for someone going through such an extreme experience. In the first days, the symptoms were relatively subtle: irritability, difficulty concentrating, sensitivity to light and sound. Around the third day, the first hallucinations appeared. Gardner mistook a traffic sign for a person standing on the sidewalk, then believed for a few moments that he was a famous football player who needed to get to the stadium for practice. As the days passed, memory lapses became severe and frequent. The ability to complete sentences without interruption disappeared. Episodes of completely disorganized thinking emerged, resembling clinically the symptoms of acute psychosis, though without the history or structure of a true psychosis. What's remarkable, and what says something important about the brain's capacity for recovery after acute deprivation, is that after a single recovery night, just one, Gardner reported feeling essentially normal. Cognitive tests conducted in the following days confirmed significant recovery, though not necessarily complete, of the accumulated deficits. The human brain has a capacity for recovery after severe acute deprivation that surprises even experienced researchers. But this doesn't mean that chronically depriving yourself of sleep is harmless. The effects of moderate chronic deprivation, accumulated over weeks, months, and years, are of a different nature, more silent, more gradual, and likely harder to fully recover from. There is a rare disease that demonstrates directly and unmistakably what happens when sleep becomes completely impossible. Fatal familial insomnia is a hereditary prion disease caused by misfolded proteins that progressively damage the thalamus, the central brain structure for sleep regulation. The symptoms begin with progressive insomnia that intensifies over weeks and months, advance to hallucinations, then to states of severe confusion and dementia, and eventually to the complete and irreversible loss of the ability to sleep. Death occurs within months, not from the disease itself directly, but from the physiological consequences of total and prolonged sleep deprivation. Only a few dozen families in the world carry the responsible genetic mutation in several different countries. What this disease demonstrates, in a cruel but unambiguous way, is that sleep is not a biological luxury that sufficiently healthy or sufficiently motivated organisms can do without. It is an absolute physiological necessity, in the same category as eating and drinking. Total and prolonged sleep deprivation is incompatible with life, and the human body possesses no mechanism whatsoever to compensate for its complete absence over an indefinite period. There is no adaptation. There is no alternative. Without sleep, the organism does not survive. The economic impact of sleep deprivation across entire populations, not just individuals, has begun to be quantified in ways that make it difficult to continue treating sleep as a purely personal matter. A RAND Corporation report published in 2016 estimated that sleep deprivation costs the American economy more than $400 billion per year in lost productivity, a number that comes not from assumptions, but from data on absenteeism, presenteeism, error rates, and quality of decision-making across different groups with different sleep patterns. The United States had the largest sleep-related economic loss among the countries studied, followed by Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The mechanism is straightforward. Workers with insufficient sleep miss more work, make more errors in the tasks they perform when present, have less capacity for innovation and creative problem-solving, and make lower quality decisions in virtually every domain that has been studied. Studies with resident physicians working 24-hour shifts, a pattern still common in many countries, showed significantly higher rates of surgical errors, diagnostic errors, and medication errors than physicians working shorter shifts that allow for adequate sleep. The idea that sleeping less is a sign of dedication, productivity, and professional seriousness, present in many corporate cultures as an implicit or explicit value, is, from the standpoint of scientific evidence, a complete inversion of reality. The professional who sleeps adequately isn't wasting productive time. They're investing in the biological substrate of all the competence, creativity, judgment, and emotional resilience that real productivity demands. Jet lag is an example of acute circadian misalignment that almost every long-distance traveler knows from direct experience, but whose biological mechanisms are less intuitive than they seem. The problem isn't just feeling sleepy at the wrong time and being alert when you should be sleeping. It's that different systems of the body resynchronize to the new time zone at different speeds, creating a period of internal desynchronization that goes beyond the simple question of sleep schedule. The central clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, responds to the light of the new environment and begins to adjust relatively quickly. But the peripheral clocks of the organs, liver, intestines, pancreas, immune system, muscles, resynchronize at their own rhythms, more slowly, each in its own time. The result is a period in which the brain is in one time zone and the liver in another, in which the immune system is still operating on the home schedule while the brain has already adopted the new one. This internal desynchronization affects digestion, metabolism, immunity, mood, and cognitive capacity in ways that accumulate during the first days after a long trip. There is a well-documented asymmetry in jet lag. Traveling westward, turning the clock back, arriving somewhere where it's earlier than at the point of origin, is consistently easier than traveling eastward, moving the clock forward, arriving somewhere where it's already later. The reason lies in a quirk of the human biological clock that we mentioned earlier. It naturally runs in cycles slightly longer than 24 hours. Delaying the schedule goes in the natural and spontaneous direction of the clock. It's like helping a river flow in the direction it already wants to go. Advancing the schedule goes against that natural tendency. It's like trying to push the river uphill. The body resists advancing more than delaying, and this manifests as the asymmetry that frequent travelers know well. Shift work is an involuntary experiment in chronic circadian misalignment that affects hundreds of millions of people around the world, in hospitals, factories, transportation networks, call centers, gas stations, security forces, and countless other contexts that modern society has made necessary. Unlike jet lag, which is temporary, lasting days and resolving spontaneously as the body resynchronizes to the new environment, night shift work imposes a permanent and unresolvable conflict between the internal biological rhythm and the external social and environmental cycle. The sun still rises and sets at the same time. Light still signals daytime to the circadian system when the night shift worker is trying to sleep. Social clocks, schedules for commerce, school, family activities, still follow the daytime pattern. The night shift worker can't simply change the time zone of their environment the way a traveler can. Large-scale epidemiological studies conducted over decades with populations of night shift workers have shown consistent associations with higher incidence of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal disorders, and certain types of cancer, especially breast cancer in women. The World Health Organization, in 2007, classified night shift work as a probable carcinogen for humans, Category 2A in the IARC classification, based on this accumulated epidemiological evidence. What's especially troubling in this data is what studies on subjective adaptation show. Even night shift workers who claim to have completely adapted to the night shift, who say they sleep well during the day, who no longer feel much discomfort with the inverted schedule, continue showing biological markers of misalignment in laboratory tests. Subjective adaptation doesn't equal physiological adaptation. The body gets used to it, but doesn't fully synchronize. It learns to function in the state of misalignment, but doesn't resolve the misalignment itself. Chronic insomnia is the most common sleep disorder in the world. Estimates place between 10 and 15% of the adult population as having chronic insomnia, with about a third experiencing occasional symptoms. But what exactly insomnia is constitutes a more complex question than it appears. It isn't simply not being able to sleep. The clinical definition requires persistent difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep, or non-restorative sleep, occurring despite adequate conditions for sleeping and producing functional impairment during the day, difficulty concentrating, irritability, fatigue, compromised performance in some domain. The most accepted model for chronic insomnia is the so-called 3P model: predisposition, precipitation, and perpetuation. There are factors that make a person more vulnerable: tendencies to ruminate, hyperactivation of the nervous system, increased sensitivity to nighttime stimuli, genetic predisposition. There is an event that precipitates the problem: acute stress, illness, loss, a life change, anything that produces one or more bad nights. And there are factors that perpetuate, that transform an acute and passing episode into a chronic condition lasting months and years: spending more time in bed trying to recover sleep, using the bedroom for activities other than sleeping, developing anticipatory anxiety about what will happen the following night, obsessively monitoring one's own states of alertness and sleepiness, changing habits and behaviors around sleep in ways that end up maintaining the problem rather than resolving it. Most people with chronic insomnia no longer have the event that precipitated it. The original stress has passed. The illness was treated. The situation that changed has stabilized. What maintains the problem is the set of behaviors, beliefs, and attention patterns that grew up around that original sleep crisis, and that continue operating long after the initial cause has disappeared. The most effective treatment for chronic insomnia, the one with the most robust evidence, the most lasting effects, and that is recommended as the first-line treatment by the leading international medical guidelines, above medications, is not pharmacological. It's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. It works directly with the perpetuating factors. It modifies dysfunctional beliefs about sleep, restructures behaviors that reduce sleep efficiency, reduces anticipatory anxiety and nighttime hyperactivation, and uses techniques such as sleep restriction, which paradoxically involves temporarily reducing time in bed to consolidate sleep and rebuild the homeostatic pressure that insomnia had weakened. The effects of CBTI hold up over the long term. People who complete it continue sleeping better months and years after treatment, because they learn something about their own sleep that stays with them. Hypnotic medications produce progressive tolerance, effects that diminish with continuous use, dependence, and rebound effects when discontinued. The reason CBTI is still underutilized isn't lack of evidence. It's lack of access, lack of trained professionals, and a culture that still treats sleep problems as something to be solved with a pill the same way a headache is solved with one. The temperature of the sleep environment has a measurable impact on sleep quality that most people consistently underestimate. The ideal temperature range for most adults falls between 60 and 67 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that many people would consider too cold for comfort, but that the body needs for sleep cycles to develop completely. The mechanism is straightforward. The body needs to reduce its core temperature by approximately 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit for sleep to begin and be maintained. This reduction is part of the physiological signal that initiates sleep, and a very warm environment interferes with it, making it harder for the body's core to reach the temperature that deep sleep requires. To cool the core, heat is redistributed to the periphery, to the hands, feet, and surface of the skin. That's why people who struggle to fall asleep often have cold hands and feet. The heat redistribution system isn't working efficiently. And that's why warm socks and hot baths before bed, which seem intuitively counterproductive to sleep, can, paradoxically, make falling asleep easier. By warming the extremities and the surface of the body, they accelerate the redistribution of heat and therefore the cooling of the core necessary for sleep to begin. Regular physical exercise is one of the most effective and best documented modulators of sleep quality. Moderate aerobic exercise, brisk walking, light running, swimming, cycling, practiced regularly increases the proportion of deep sleep in subsequent nights, reduces the time needed to fall asleep, decreases the number of nighttime awakenings, and improves the subjective quality of sleep in virtually every population group studied, including healthy adults, older adults with fragmented sleep, and people with insomnia. The mechanisms involve increased homeostatic sleep pressure, improved body temperature regulation, and effects on the neurotransmitter systems that modulate sleep. The popular belief that exercising at night harms sleep is an oversimplification that isn't supported by the available evidence for most people. Many studies show that nighttime exercise doesn't impair sleep for the majority of individuals, and that discouraging people from exercising during the only time available to them, often the afternoon or evening, may cause more harm to sleep and overall health than the possible negative impact of late exercise. Sleep deprivation alters in specific and measurable ways how people process and respond to human faces and expressions, and the consequences of these alterations extend beyond individual behavior. The amygdala, the central brain structure for emotional processing and threat detection, responds in a significantly exaggerated way to negative facial expressions after sleep deprivation, while the functional connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the connection that normally allows for moderating and contextualizing these emotional responses, is reduced. The result is a person who is more emotionally reactive to negative signals in the environment, and less able to use reasoning to moderate that reactivity. Behavioral studies showed that sleep-deprived people have more difficulty recognizing expressions of joy in human faces, less tendency to trust the faces of strangers, and more propensity to interpret neutral or ambiguous expressions as threatening. One experiment showed that sleep-deprived people emit social signals that other individuals, without knowing about the deprivation, evaluating only video recordings, identify as less trustworthy, less sociable, and less appealing as conversation partners. Sleep deprivation isn't just a problem for the person who sleeps poorly. It's a problem that affects, in subtle but real ways, everyone who interacts with someone who sleeps poorly. Researcher Roger E. Kirch, after decades analyzing historical documents from various pre-industrial European cultures, letters, diaries, medical records, behavioral guides, literature, proposed something that surprised the sleep field when it was published in 2001. The pattern of sleep consolidated in a single continuous nightly block, which we treat as natural and universal, may be a relatively recent invention of industrial civilization. What historical documents from pre-industrial cultures across multiple countries and contexts describe as normal is a biphasic pattern, 2 separate periods of sleep with a waking interval of 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, generally between midnight and 2 or 3 in the morning. This interval, referred to in historical documents as the first watch and second watch, was used for a variety of activities considered normal and integral parts of the nightly routine: praying, reading, talking with a partner, making love, having a warm broth, visiting nearby neighbors, smoking a pipe, simply lying in a state of quiet relaxation and contemplation. Physicians of the era wrote about the pattern as something healthy and natural. Behavioral guides described appropriate activities for each period. It was part of life, not an irregularity. With the arrival of electric lighting in the late 19th century, which extended the period of social activity into the night, and with the pressures of the industrial rhythm that valued efficiency and the continuity of the daytime work period, this pattern was progressively replaced by the single block we consider normal today. Modern studies that placed participants in conditions of artificial light deprivation, exposed only to natural light over several weeks, observed that many spontaneously returned to a biphasic pattern within a few weeks, with a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. The consolidated sleep we consider natural may itself be a relatively recent product of the specific conditions of modern life. Artificial intelligence is beginning to transform sleep research in ways that would have been impossible with traditional approaches. Machine learning algorithms trained on large databases of polysomnographies complete sleep recordings with EEG, electrooculogram, electromyogram, heart rate, and breathing, are identifying patterns in sleep EEG that trained human eyes don't detect, patterns that are statistically consistent enough to be informative about the individual's health beyond the sleep parameters themselves. One notable example is the development of algorithms to estimate the biological age of the brain from sleep EEG. The model learns how the specific patterns of brain waves during sleep change over a lifetime in healthy people, and uses that knowledge to estimate the physiological age of an individual's brain, an estimate that may be higher or lower than their chronological age. In preliminary studies, this sleep brain age proved to be a predictor of mortality and future cognitive decline independently of other health markers. Another emerging application is the early detection of neurodegenerative diseases through subtle patterns in sleep that precede the appearance of clinical symptoms. Alterations in sleep spindles and slow waves during deep sleep appear to precede the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's by years, possibly by decades. If these patterns can be reliably and non-invasively detected at home, through increasingly precise sleep monitoring devices, sleep may become one of the earliest available windows into brain health across an entire lifetime. One of the most fundamental and least resolved questions in sleep neuroscience is this: why is deep sleep, with all its intense synchronized electrical activity, with delta waves that involve hundreds of millions of neurons in coordinated oscillations, accompanied by an almost complete loss of consciousness? While REM sleep, equally active in terms of raw electrical activity, produces rich subjective experiences, narratives, emotionally intense. What differentiates the two states, from the standpoint of consciousness, when the electrical activity is, at a certain level of analysis, equally intense? Contemporary theories of consciousness make different predictions about this, and sleep serves as a central testing ground for many of them. The integrated information theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness depends on a specific type of organization of information, not just neural activity, but integration of information between regions of the brain in a way that creates a whole greater than the sum of its parts. In this theory, deep sleep may represent a state in which, despite intense activity, the integration of information between regions collapses. Delta waves occur in a relatively local way, not connecting the entire brain in an integrated network the way REM does. Sleep offers a natural laboratory for studying consciousness in a way that no other situation allows, a state in which neural activity is intense but consciousness is absent, contrasting with another state in which activity is equally intense and consciousness is present. Understanding why the same organ, with the same intensity of activity, can both have consciousness and not have it, depending on something in the organization of that activity, is to understand something fundamental about what consciousness is. There's something that connects everything said throughout this journey, something that emerges when you place each discovery alongside the others and look at the pattern they form together, at what they collectively suggest about this experience we all share and that no one fully understands. Sleep isn't a pause in life. It's a constitutive part of it, perhaps the most fundamental and most silently essential part. It isn't the time when nothing happens. It's the time when some of the most important things happen, without witnesses, beyond the reach of consciousness and will, governed by systems that evolution spent hundreds of millions of years refining because the cost of not having them was simple: death. The sleeping brain consolidates what was learned during the day, processes what was felt, clears what accumulated over hours of intense neural activity, and prepares with precision for what's to come. The sleeping body repairs tissues that daily use damages, regulates hormones that wakefulness throws off balance, strengthens defenses that the environment threatens, and calibrates rhythms that, without this nightly calibration, would progressively drift out of sync with the world. And the dreaming mind, whatever that means in all its depth, whatever occurs during those hours of internal experience that morning barely remembers, seems to be doing something that no waking state can fully replicate. Something that sleep protects with the same care with which it protects deep sleep, lymphatic cleaning, the release of growth hormone. The question we started with, why do we sleep, still doesn't have a single definitive answer. Science keeps working on it. New discoveries emerge every year, expanding and complicating what we thought we knew, revealing functions we didn't suspect, suggesting connections that seemed impossible. But what has already been found points to something that may be more interesting than any simple answer could be. We sleep because we are organisms that need, periodically, to return to themselves. Sleep is the moment when biology reclaims what waking life consumes, and does so with a precision, a complexity, and a delicacy that science is only beginning to understand. Surrendering to sleep every night, trusting in the temporary disappearance of oneself and the return by morning, trusting that the brain will do what it needs to do without being supervised, without instruction, without help, remains one of the most universal and at the same time most personal experiences of human existence. And you're about to live it once more. Let the body sink a little deeper, let the breathing become a little slower, a little deeper, a little more automatic, let the thoughts begin to lose the shape that keeps them separate from one another. Let the boundary between what you think and what you feel start to blur, and let sleep find the way it has always found, every night, throughout your entire life. And as you drift into a deep and restful sleep, remember to subscribe, so these stories can keep finding you, night after night. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.